Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's second meeting in 2020. Could I ask everyone please to make sure their mobile phones are on silent? The first agenda item is the UK Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill. And before we go any further, I would like to ask members if there are any interest to declare, and I'm going to start off by declaring that I have an interest in a family farming partnership. Peter.
Likewise, Convener, I have to declare an interest as a member of a farming partnership as well.
Okay, and Stuart.
I own with my spouse a very small registered agricultural holding.
Okay, thank you. So the first agenda item relates to the committee's consideration of legislative consent memorandum lodged by Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Connectivity. The LCM relates to the Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill, currently considered in the House of Commons. As a lead committee, we were required to reflect upon the memorandum and then consider whether we are content with its terms. We will then report our findings to the Parliament. The DPLR committee considered the LCM at its meeting yesterday. And whilst the committee had no points to make on the terms of the LCM, it did agree to write to both the Scottish and UK governments on the issue of process. I'd like to welcome from the Scottish Government Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy, Alan Fraser, the CAP Scheme Manager, and David McClellan, the Solicitor. And Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a short opening statement of 2 minutes, please?
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to thank everybody for finding the time to provide me with the opportunity to give evidence on the LCM lodged by the Scottish Government in relation to the UK Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill. Let me be crystal clear. Without this bill, we will not be able to make payments to farmers and crofters through the direct payment schemes for the claim year 2020, and I'll explain why. The compressed timetable to which we are collectively working is a direct result of the need to pass this legislation in advance of the UK withdrawing from the EU on the 31st of this month and the UK Government's timescales for achieving that withdrawal. Now, while the Scottish Government believes the best option for the UK as a whole and for Scotland is to remain in the EU as voted for by the people of Scotland, we accept the need to make preparations for the exceptional circumstances which arise as a result of withdrawal from the EU under the terms of the withdrawal agreement negotiated by the UK Government. Given that the Scottish Government recognises how critical the direct payment schemes are to Scottish farmers and crofters, this includes making all necessary preparations to ensure support payments to farmers and crofters in Scotland can continue to be legislated for and made. Now, this legislation is needed as a direct result of the withdrawal agreement, which provides in Article 137 that the EU direct payments regulation will not apply in the UK for the 2020 claim year. We therefore need there to be primary legislation in place to ensure that there is a legal basis for the direct payment schemes in 2020. Now, I did raise this issue with the Secretary for DEFRA in July last year and have been pursuing a resolution since then. This is a problem with respect created by the UK Government, identified to them, and one they needed to fix, of which notice was given last July by me in writing. This bill finally intends to solve the problem, albeit late in the day, so I've lodged the legislative CM which we're discussing today, and as set out in that memorandum to reflect the exceptional circumstances we find ourselves in, I also intend to lodge an LCM seeking the Scottish Parliament's formal legislative consent to the bill. Without this bill, we wouldn't be able to make any payments under the direct payment scheme for the 2020 claim year. This would cause severe financial hardship throughout Scotland's farmers and crofters and to the wider agricultural sector. None of us could thaw that or accept that. That in turn could result in many businesses folding, leading to land abandonment. For that reason, the Scottish Government is recommending that the Scottish Parliament approves this motion. The bill will be implemented using secondary legislation made under it. Scottish ministers will be making a Scottish statutory instrument under the powers in this bill, and it's anticipated the UK Government will make a number of SIs that will extend to Scotland. Although time limits will be exceedingly tight, these instruments will be subject to the affirmative procedure, and so the committee will have a chance to provide a degree of scrutiny. So I hope, Convener, this gives the committee an understanding of why, in these exceptional circumstances, the Scottish Government is recommending that the Parliament give legislative consent to this bill. And I and David McClellan and Alan Fraser are happy to take any questions that members have. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. There are some questions. I'd like to start off by asking a question for clarity. I remind you of the evidence you gave to the committee on Wednesday, the 31st of October 2018, when you were asked clearly by the Deputy Convener, was that there was, and if I phrase the question, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that NFU Scotland is concerned there may not be a legal vehicle for delivering payments beyond March 2019. For the record, can you give me your thinking on that? And you went on, Cabinet Secretary, to say, and I quote you, I am absolutely satisfied of that for very good legal reasons that I've indicated. We will provide the committee with the legal advice and copper-plated in detail to allow, that shows us we're allowed to make those payments. What's changed?
Well, Convener, as I've said, it is perfectly possible to ensure that payments are made, and we identified what the UK need to do last July, and I can provide the committee with the correspondence if it so wishes. But we identified last July, and I wrote to the Secretary of State for DEFRA on the 9th of July requesting confirmation that the UK Government would take steps to ensure that, subject to the Scottish Parliament's view and consent, there would be legislation in place for the direct payment scheme in the 220 scheme year. This is something that is reserved to Westminster. They need to do their job. Well, we're doing our job, but they need to do their job. And when I gave the committee assurances that payments could be continued, of course, I did so on the basis of good faith in working with DEFRA, as I do regularly, to ensure that they would do their job. And they have acknowledged they need to do their job. However, they didn't start doing the job until this month.
Well, Cabinet Secretary, this is evidence you gave the committee, and if the situation had changed, it might have been helpful to warn the committee.
No,
but
it hasn't changed.
Sorry,
Cabinet
Secretary. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, and with the greatest respect, you will perhaps let me finish my question, as I will make sure that every committee member has a chance to finish. You said at that stage, for good legal reasons, which were beyond doubt, which you would provide to the committee, which you never did provide to the committee. I'm not convinced that I've heard anything today that would change that position. It is you saying that it is somebody else's fault, whereas at that stage you were convinced that you were right. In fact, David Barnes, in the evidence session, who was your advisor at that stage, also corrected the questioning, saying that there was no chance that it couldn't be paid post-2019. It's obviously changed, and I haven't heard the reason why, Cabinet Secretary. Could you perhaps explain?
Well, I think we're just going to have to respectfully agree to disagree. It was always the basis, Convener, and I made it absolutely clear that we will do our part of the job, and we're doing that, and we will come on to discuss that in the next item on the agenda. But it's always been the case that the UK needs to deal with its part of the job, and it accepts that. What I'm saying today is that whereas we identified in a letter to DEFRA last summer that this was something, because of Section 137 of the withdrawal agreement, that they needed to do, and they agreed with that. They agreed with that in the correspondence that I have. They needed to do their part as well. Now, if you don't accept that, Convener, then I'm afraid you will have to take it up with DEFRA. But that is the situation, and there's nothing remarkable about it. And I think it's perfectly reasonable that the Scottish Government is entitled to assume a reasonable level of competence in the UK Government. But if you take a different view, then that's entirely up to you.
Well, I think we may have to agree to differ. I'm disappointed that the evidence that you gave the committee in 2018 appears to have substantially changed, and this is the first time that we've heard about it. Now,
well,
there are some...
With respect, I do not accept that, Convener, and I just put that on record.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Stuart, you wanted to ask some questions, followed by Mike Rumbles, followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you very much, Convener. I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary has seen the letter that I think went out either late last night or early this morning copied to Mike Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Government Business Constitutional Relations, and to Teresa Villiers at the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on the issue, on the views of the delegated powers in relation to timescale. Now, I pick up in particular on the second page. It will be the fourth bullet point, which is in relation to the follow-on UK SIs, which Cabinet Secretary you referred to in your opening remarks, which have to also become law before the 31st of January. Now, and being affirmative, they're of relevance to us. Now, I understand that now the bill that we're talking about here, granting an LCM for, will go to the House of Lords on Monday, the 27th of January, which is substantially later than had previously been thought. That leaves us only with that single week in which to consider the SIs, and indeed our meeting is on the 29th, so we have one scheduled occasion. Now, my question, therefore, because that's the preamble, is to what extent are we aware of what the content of the SIs, which I accept will be necessary. You can't do everything in primary legislation. You need a system of secondary legislation, particularly in these kind of complex moving situations. Have we any insight into what might be in the SIs that we will find ourselves considering on the 29th of January on behalf of the Parliament? And indeed, have we any sense that we will have them by that date? Because the House of Lords is completing its process in this bill only on the Monday. I feel a little discomfort that we might be able to get them on time to consider them at all. And I just wonder what the government knows about that.
Firstly, Mr Stevenson, the existence of the DPLRC letter was drawn to my attention just before I entered this meeting, and your clerk kindly provided me with a copy of it. This is the first I've seen it. I gather it's been made available last night to the Scottish Government. So I should say we haven't had an opportunity to study it. We will do that in the course of the day. I do note that it states, in its first bullet point, it states is that the time available for the committee to scrutinise the LCM is wholly inadequate. And I entirely agree with that. But that is as a direct result that the UK government has failed to act since last July on something that it admitted had to be done. That's why we're having this last-minute scramble. Now, regarding the technical questions, these are very important questions. They're not simply technical. I did in the opening statement say that the bill will be implemented using secondary legislation, that Scottish ministers will be making a Scottish statutory instrument, and it's anticipated the UK government will make a number of SIs. So there's quite a lot of work to be done. I think it might be helpful, because it's important, if Mr McLennan, the legal advisor to myself in this matter, could give a bit more information about what that would entail, with your permission, Convener.
Yes, thank you. So, first of all, just to clarify a point about the procedure to which these instruments will be subject to, the provisions of the bill which have been introduced are that they will be subject to a made affirmative procedure, rather than the usual affirmative, which means that they can come into force very quickly, but still have a degree of scrutiny over them. In terms of what the content of those instruments are likely to be, the operative provisions of the bill, which sets out how the powers may be exercised, are very similar to the powers which were available under the EU Withdrawal Act. So it's essentially a deficiency correcting exercise. So we expect that the SIs and the SSIs will look and feel very similar and play a similar role to the deficiency correcting SIs and SSIs, which I think this committee has already scrutinised as part of the no-deal preparation process.
But it is correct, is it not, that the made SIs that Westminster will bring forward will touch on devolved areas and therefore are of specific interest to us. And therefore I go back to just, do we know anything that gives us comfort that there will be an opportunity to consider, albeit, I suspect by the sounds of it, in arrears to their having effect, potentially. Have we any sense of when they might be available to this committee and other parts of Parliament, such as the DPLR, which I think must obviously meet on a Tuesday. In other words, one day after the House of Lords is giving its final consideration to the bill.
Or are you happy David answers that? I mean, it's quite difficult to put a date, I suspect, from your point of view.
Well, all of these difficulties arise from the matter I've described, the way this has been dealt with. And, you know, with respect, and my argument all along has been that we're dealing with mechanisms today. We're not dealing with substantive policy about what the money should be used for. We're simply providing mechanisms that existing monies under existing schemes can be paid in this. And therefore, to me, this should not be a matter of party politics.
No.
It's a matter of housekeeping. And the problem is that you can either have good housekeeping or bad housekeeping. And there's just no doubt, Convener, that the UK government has been found caught napping on the housekeeping front. And the UK government has created a situation where Scottish farmers will be severely disadvantaged if the necessary legislation is not put in place. The fact that that has deleterious consequences for this Parliament and is frankly disrespectful to this Parliament and this government doesn't alter the fact that if we do not act to pass this by allowing the LCM to have the approval of Parliament, then we will be putting our farmers and crofters at a tremendous financial disadvantage. And I hope that that is something upon which we're all agreed we cannot permit to happen.
Mike Rumbles.
I'm all in favour of good housekeeping, and it is a housekeeping question. I'm genuinely confused a little bit about the process here. Excuse me. In the very next agenda item, we will be dealing with our agriculture bill. And in Section 3 of the agriculture bill, it says we're proposing that the provisions of the legislation continue to operate. That's the process, operate, in relation to these payments in Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. I assume when the agricultural bill was put together, you were of the view that we didn't need to make this legislation any earlier because it was covered. Payments for 2020, because this deals with payments after 2020, and Scottish agriculture, as we all know, is entirely devolved. This is a devolved issue. The very fact that we're asking for an LCM ensures that it's a devolved issue, asking the UK Parliament to legislate. But we've got an agriculture bill. So my question really is, should this have been introduced earlier and dealt with in the proper process that we could have done? Or can it still be dealt with, and this is an important one, can it still be dealt, because that's past history, but the important thing is to get it right. So can we solve this problem by simply putting an amendment into the agricultural bill to cover 2020? And is the reason why that might not be a good idea because I want to make sure that the payments go to farmers this year. Is it the case that it would be too late to put an amendment in to make effect to the payments this year? Because after all, I think we're all agreed we want to make sure the payments get paid.
Well, you know, thank you for the question. I appreciate the process is not straightforward, and I appreciate that for all of us here, causes us to question aspects of the process. So far as the procedural matters are concerned, I think maybe Mr. McLennan might be it might be helpful if he were to answer the points of the question about the points of process. Yes. David.
So I think just to flag one of the slight difficulties we've had with this bill is that the data by which it was needed has been a slight moving target because it's about payments during the transition period, essentially. So it has to be enforced by the time the withdrawal agreement comes into force itself. And so we were at one point thought that was going to be the 31st of October, and then obviously it's now the 31st of January.
Could I ask you, sorry to interrupt, but could I just, so that we get to the quick,
Yeah.
When are the payments due this year in 2020? Because if we don't have the legislation, we can't make the payments. That's basically what has been said. So we've got to have the legislation. Yes. So when are the payments
due?
Well,
the basic payments under the payment schedule, which we've recently published, the basic payments will commence in, I think I'm right in saying, February.
Oh, right, okay.
And will be, the target is to meet 95% of those by June. And also the payment schedule, which we've published, now requires us to meet by June this year the Pillar 2 payments as well. So forestry and aches, they have to be completed by June to the extent of 95.24%, I think is the figure of the value. So, so this bill deals with these payments, Mr Rumbles, if you see what I mean. The later bill deals with changes to, to schemes after the end of the transition period. So there are two distinct processes.
So an amendment to our agriculture bill.
Just for clarity, Cabinet Secretary, the payment that has got to be made by June, the balancing payment, the 2020 payment is not made in 2020, it's made in 2021, the balancing payment. So my understanding is that, just because I think there's a dubiety on years here, that the single farm payment is usually made in the period October through to Christmas, depending on processing of claims, with the balancing payment at 95% made by June the following year under the current scheme. I think that's what you're saying. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Because that's my understanding.
Well, no. The payments that were made in October were loan payments, so they weren't regarded as advance payments of the basic payment scheme.
But those were 2019 payments, not 2020 payments.
Well, to the extent that these are technical questions, I think it would be probably appropriate if Mr McLennan wants to answer that one.
Yes, obviously, as you probably are aware, the basic payment is made in arrears. So when we're talking about the claim year 2020, we're talking about money applied for this year paid next.
Yes, so it will be applied. The opening window for filling in the claims is usually May the 15th, and it's completed, and the claims are then paid for 2020 as a proportion, 90% in October, and the balance of the payment is usually has to be paid under EU regulation to 95% by June the following year. So 2020 claim forms will be submitted shortly. They have to be submitted by a set date, usually around May, and the payment will be made, start to be made in October. So the payments that are outstanding at the moment are last year's payments. That's why they're paid in arrears.
And there's sufficient legislative cover for those?
There are. So we're talking about the payments that will be made for this year, which will be made at the end of this year and next year. Sorry, Mike,
No,
just wanted to clarify
I'm glad
that.
you intervened, Convener, because it's clarified it for me. I think there's been a bit of confusion. I'm genuinely trying to get to the point. I'm not making any political point at all. I'm just trying to make sure that we are the responsible committee for dealing with agriculture under the devolved settlement under the Scotland Act. It's entirely devolved. So the bill, quite rightly produced by the Cabinet Secretary that we're going to deal with in the next agenda item, gives us, if it's passed, gives us the legal power to make payments post-2020. It does. So my question really, therefore, is the LCM completely irrelevant? Because you've just said that the 1919 payments, which are paid this year, are already covered, and the bill is covering the payments from 2020. So I'm not convinced, please convince me, I'm not convinced that we need the LCM.
I think Mr McLennan is going to answer this one as well, just for clarity's purposes.
So the two bills are very distinct. This bill is simply a mechanism for creating a legal basis to continue what we're doing just now, to fix the hole that the withdrawal agreement creates. And then the next bill is to make changes going forward. I hope that answers your question.
Well, no, it doesn't, because we've just... Correct me if I am wrong. You've just said to this committee that the legal payment for the actual payments to farmers this year, the 1919 payments, are already covered in law. This bill, if we pass it, will cover all future payments post-2020. Is that correct?
It creates a legal basis for making...
So we've got the legal basis if we pass this law. The UK legislation is covering England and Wales, and what we're asking, what the Scottish Government are asking to do is for us to ask the UK government to legislate on our behalf for something that we're already legislating for.
Do you want to
Stuart,
We're supposed to ask it now.
okay.
If I heard the opening remarks correctly, and I may not have done, I accept that, this all derives from Section 158 in the EU Withdrawal Bill, which in effect withdraws our permission to do what we've been doing and requires to be replaced by the UK Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill. Is that a correct understanding? And I'm 158, I might be wrong, that's my...
137 is the...
It's 137,
the article,
right.
But yes, so the withdrawal agreement continues the effect of all European law for the transition period, with the exception of the direct payments regulation.
So 137 essentially removes our ability to make the direct payments, and this bill
No,
brings it back.
Stuart, so I think we need clarity on this.
Well,
I'm not sure that's what Mr. McLennan just said.
Well, that's
David.
fine.
Is that what you just said?
Yes, essentially. So there's the payments which are going out the door this year, which were applied for last year.
Yep.
That's covered in European law. We come out of the European Union at the end of this month and come into the terms of the withdrawal agreement. European law is carried over, with the exception of the direct payments regulation.
Yes.
So for anybody making payments this year, for making applications this year, we require fresh legislation. After the transition period finishes, we come into the new post-European world where our bill our Scottish Agriculture Bill, which we're about to hear evidence on, becomes relevant.
So, David, I understand exactly what you're saying, but I think the question that Mike is asking is that the bill that we have to consider after this session already makes allowances for 2020 payments. Mike, have I got that wrong?
Well, I'm now confused because what Mr. McLennan said to me in answer to my question and what Mr. McLennan has said in answer to Stuart Stevenson's question. So if I could just ask for clarity here. I've got no political, this has nothing to do with, this is purely a process question because I can't see the point for legislating twice, right? So the point I'm asking, if you could give me clarity on this, let me put it this way, if we didn't pass the LCM, and we relied on the agricultural bill and it was approved, okay, will there be any disruption to the farmers' payments?
Yes,
And what disruption would that be?
because the withdrawal agreement carves out the direct payments regulation, there would be no basis in law for direct payments after the end of this month.
Right.
That's what this bill rectifies.
Okay, but how does that square with what you said to me about the direct payments would continue this year because they're 1919 payments?
Because the legislation which governs payments which were claimed for in 2019 and are paid this year are part of European law, which is because it was European law when they were claimed for, it will still be a legal basis for the payments to be made. It might be easier if we put this in writing to you. I appreciate it is a difficult time.
I think the problem is timing, but I think what we're being told, or I'm understanding we're being told, is that the claims that result as the applications that were paid in 2019 will be made in 2019 and 2020. Any applications for 2020, which will be made by May this year, are not covered by legislation, which is why you need this legislative consent motion, and the agricultural bill that's in front of us doesn't cover it. That's my understanding of it. And Stuart's disagreeing with me. So, I mean, I've been 15 years in the industry, so if I'm confused,
Maybe I'm confused, Convener, and I'm quite content to be told so if that's so. My understanding, and let me express it this way, is that the payments that are already in the system and claims made, that our ability to make payments on the basis of what was submitted, has already been submitted, expires on the 31st of January because of the paragraph 137 in the European Withdrawal Bill, which takes away our ability to make the payments. It doesn't take away the existence of the claims.
No.
That's clear, but it takes away our ability to make the payments, even if we had the money. You know, it's not about us. That's a different issue for another discussion. It simply is the technical thing that it's taken everything forward except the power to do this, and that's why they're having to bring this UK Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill forward to recreate the power to us, and furthermore, it is of course a reserved power. to do that, not something we can legislate for. I'm expressing my understanding,
Okay.
and I now want to be criticised and corrected.
I would briefly just like to clarify from Mike whether he is clear in the explanations that have been given.
I'd make one final attempt, if I may, and just a yes or a no would be really helpful from Mr McLennan. I don't want to do anything that would stop payments to farmers. That's absolutely clear. So I want to get this right, but I don't want to do duplication. And if it's entirely entirely devolved issue, we should be dealing with it. However, so if I've got this right, just say yes when I've finished, please. We need the LCM because leaving the European Union on the 31st of January takes the legal basis for paying the farmers away. So we don't have any legislation. And it's too late to include that in the Scottish Agricultural Bill because we won't have finished the stage 3 in Royal Assent before the payments are needed to start. Have I understood this correctly?
The first half of your statement's correct. The second half of why we're suggesting an LCM is not really a question for a lawyer, I don't think.
But surely the question is whether they were covered legally. It is a question for the lawyers, isn't it?
Cabinet Secretary, I mean, it appears we're sort of slightly stuck, but I mean, I think the point is that the bill that we've got in front of us has some time still to go through the Scottish Parliament, and it appears to me that this is a way of ensuring that payments are made. But Cabinet Secretary, do you want to comment on that?
Well, you know, I appreciate that these are complex matters and they're complex legal matters. And what I would say to the committee is that, you know, I absolutely understand the frustration. I agree with it. The situation we're in is not great, but sometimes we have to act on the basis of what we need to do, even if we don't agree with it. This is one of those situations. The deadline of 31st January was imposed by the UK government, not by us, for a policy that we wholly oppose. But because it is now going ahead, I have a duty to make sure that we make sure that people are not prejudiced. And I see it as very straightforward. I don't want to make any political capital about scoring points in politics. I just want to make sure the farmers are continuing to be paid. And that's the situation I find myself in. I absolutely share the frustrations people have, but all along, my intent has been to create mechanisms to allow payments to continue. The wider debate about Brexit or post-Brexit are separate and vital issues, but they are separate. And I think, you know, this discussion does perhaps illustrate the grave difficulty of having a clear legal discussion on a committee basis. And I fully appreciate that. And I make no criticism of any member, because I think we all want to get to the same place. But we have given this a lot of thought. And we have, in the opening statement, I think I did set out very clearly the basis of the legal advice that I have and have had for a long time. And we didn't just come at this at the last minute, convener. You know, we tried to cooperate with the UK government on a policy we didn't agree last July to get this done, and have been working in good faith with them ever since. And okay, they've taken a bit of time, but that's not the end of the world. You know, in a few weeks' time, everybody will have forgotten about this, frankly. The key thing is that farmers and crofters continue to get paid, and the people out there watching aren't prejudiced by what happens in here. So, you know, I regret the fact we're having these complex legal discussions, but I think trying to have these discussions in a committee is extremely difficult. And it's difficult, actually, for a legal advisor just to be quizzed like in this particular way. And what we will do after this session at my behest is to study the official report at SGLD level, and if there's anything else that we need to come back with, convener, to clarify, I give you my undertaking that we will do that to help you in your future deliberations.
Okay, and Cabinet Secretary, I thank you for that. I mean, the timescale is so tight, I fear we're going to have to make a decision today, and I, like you, am frustrated by the timescale as well. So, Richard.
Yeah, I just don't see how members can't get this. We've known for months that everything changes after the 31st of January. We're out of EU law. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and I quote from their letter in regard to direct payments, the time available for the committee to scrutinise the LCM for this bill is wholly inadequate. The bill was introduced in the UK Parliament on Thursday the 9th of January and was lodged just on the 13th of January, and the committee appreciates, however, that the time for the bill timetable is out with the control of the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, am I correct in suggesting that the previous comments you made were based on DEFRA doing their job, and now their failure has brought about this issue? To my mind, not your fault, Cabinet Secretary. You're trying to make it right. So any complaint that this has been changed or being rushed should be laid at the door of the UK Government. Am I correct?
I'm sure you'll be delighted to answer that, and you could wax eloquently on it. Could I ask you to do it shortly, because I have a heap of questions coming up on this.
Well, I'd like an answer. Am I correct?
Well, I do think that things could have been dealt with more swiftly by the UK Government, but really what concerns me more is to make sure that we continue to pay with a reasonable efficiency payments due to farmers and crofters. That's what gets me up in the morning. That's why I had a discussion with the officials this morning about the nitty-gritty, not of this, but of getting the money out to LFAST recipients, to basic payment schemes, to Pillar 2 schemes, as I do every Wednesday morning. And that's...
Thank you for doing your job. Thank you.
Jamie Green, followed by John Philly, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I don't want to drag this out, but I have a technical question, perhaps it might be a legal one. The bill that we're going to come on to, the Agricultural Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill, would be due to commence on the 1st of January 2021, therefore after the period that the bill that this LCM relates to. And it is just an if, and all this is if, but if there was an extension to the transition period beyond the 31st of December 2020, would the bill that this LCM covers be naturally extended to cover that transition? What effect would that have on the implementation of the other piece of legislation which we're looking at next? If that makes sense.
Well, I think my understanding is that this UK bill will cover an extended transition period.
Right.
I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's
yeah. So if the transition period is extended beyond the end of this year, then this bill would, just as it covers the period from now to the end of the year, it would cover from now until the expiry of the extended transition.
Okay, so therefore, I guess my question, the real question is and would you anticipate, therefore, that future payments would be made under an extended UK bill or under the new legislation that we may pass in Scotland alone?
Well, if the transition period is extended, then the powers to make the payments for the claim year 220, and in theory, if the extension were for a long period, then this bill would allow us to would give us the legal power, the legal competence, the legal mechanism to make those payments for that extended period. Whether it goes beyond a particular financial year or not, I don't think makes a difference, but I'll just check with Mr McLennan.
No, that's right. The fundamental power is under the regulation, whether it's in our law by virtue of European law, this bill or future legislation.
That's very helpful, thank you.
John Finney.
I think reference was made earlier to moving target, and that was in relation to the Brexit day. Frankly, crofters and farmers will be astonished by this debate this morning. They would have thought everyone would have got their act together, absolutely. And I think any neutral political observer would say that the way the UK Government has treated the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, our local authorities, indeed our citizens in regard to the budget, it wouldn't surprise them that there's been difficulties in relation to this. So I think it's worth repeating again, Convener, that it's your colleague, Mr Simpson, it's your colleague who says that it's been wholly inadequate, and I absolutely agree with him. What I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary was, in relation to your representations, Cabinet Secretary, to the UK Government, at any point after July, was there any meaningful engagement on this hugely important issue for our crofters and farmers?
Yes, as I said, I wrote to the Secretary of State for DEFRA on the 9th of July requesting confirmation that the UK Government would take steps to ensure that subject to Scottish Parliament's use and consent, there would be legislation in place for the direct payments in the 220 scheme year. And in response to your question, Mr Finney, on the 29th of August, the Secretary of State responded to state that if it proved to be necessary, then she was confident that the legislation could be in place and that the UK Government would seek the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament. It's my intention to, unless there is any material in those letters, and I don't think there is, which is of a confidential nature, to share that correspondence with the committee so that the full picture is available. I should say also, in response to Mr Finney, that my officials have worked and sought to work with DEFRA officials on all of these matters. These are technical matters. They're not matters that ministers spend their time dealing with, nor should they. They're dealt with by officials, and rightly so. And the cooperation between officials has been reasonably good. In other words, there's been a cooperation as to what needs to be done to ensure the objective about continuing to be able to make payments in all circumstances. And because of the legal complexities involved, these were challenging. But the point I'm making is that, we're not just coming at this in January. I think, to be fair to ourselves, we identified a potential problem and a potential solution last July. We wrote to the UK Government and they agreed with us that as I understand it, that the problem we identified was a problem and the solution we postulated was a solution that could be deployed. Perhaps because of the election and everything else, things have just slipped and all the rest. But I do absolutely share Mr Finney's first comments that, crofters and farmers witnessing this discussion today, very few of them will be impressed, I imagine.
Thank you. Can I just make an observation on a comment Mr Finney made? It was Graham Simpson, the convener of the DPLR committee, who wrote to the UK and the Scottish governments regarding this on behalf of the committee. And you won't be surprised that I actually agree with him on the timing being wholly inadequate. I hope you weren't by inference suggesting that I wouldn't agree with him. Sorry, Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, folks. We're discussing this right up to the wire, which is 31st of January, and you said that there are going to be more SSIs. And as the letter from Graham Simpson, the convener of the DPLR, has said, that this is totally unacceptable, given that we're not getting the time to scrutinise. Why are we in this position, given that the date of leaving the EU has been delayed three times? Does that mean that we were never ready to leave at these former dates of leaving, and that, far from getting Brexit done, this is only the beginning of a very long process?
Well, I think that's maybe partly a political question, partly a legal question. I think I've really answered the legal stuff. On the political side, I don't think the UK are ready for Brexit at all. And we'll come on to discuss that, I think, in the next session. And the imposition of an arbitrary deadline of the 31st of January imposes extraordinary pressures on the procedures, the democratic procedures of this Parliament and the Westminster Parliament. But that is a direct result of decisions taken by the UK Government.
Right, and I think all committees now have had, all committee members have had a chance to raise the questions they want. Because of the short timescale of this, I'm going to propose to the committee that we look at and approve at this stage of the committee meeting the draft motion that's been set out in the LCM, and then work out a form of wording for the report briefly when we get a chance to later in the committee, so that we can continue with the questions. I hope the committee are satisfied with that way of dealing with things. I'm not seeing any shaking of heads. So, can I just say that, therefore, the question I want to ask at this stage is, are members content to recommend in the committee's report that the Parliament should agree the draft motion as set out in the LCM? We are agreed. So we'll sort out the actual wording of the report, which will have to be sent out today for consideration in the Parliament tomorrow. Now, Cabinet Secretary, thank you and your officials for giving evidence. I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting. I would ask committee members and everyone to change over their positions of the witnesses as quickly as possible, and committee members to stay in the room so we can move straight on. So I briefly suspend the meeting. Okay, I'd like now to move on to agenda item 2, which is the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. I would just remind people that 3 members of the committee have already made declarations at the beginning of the committee meeting, and those remain extant. This is the committee's final evidence panel on the bill, and today we're going to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government officials. I'd like to welcome the panel, which is Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy, John Kerr, who is the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, George Burgess, the Deputy Director of Food and Drink, Ali McAlpine, the Senior Statistician, Rural and Environmental Science and Analytical Services, and Vicky Dunlop, the Bill Team Leader, and David McLennan, the Scottish Government Legal Director. Cabinet Secretary, I think you wanted to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence on the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. There's lots to say in this bill, and I'll cover as much as possible. The context is the UK's decision to withdraw from the EU, a decision that doesn't have the support of the people of Scotland. Nonetheless, as a responsible government, we must prepare to take necessary powers to continue to support our farmers and crofters. For that reason, we're bringing forward this bill at this time. The Scottish Government could have opted to take powers for Scotland through the UK bill, but agriculture is devolved, and the Scottish Government believe that legislation for devolved policy is a matter for this Parliament. I note from the previous evidence sessions the discussion about future long-term agricultural policy. That is not the purpose of this bill, nor part of the relevant discussion today, in our view. There is a lot of work being done on future policy, and obviously that will form part of future discussions. However, officials are preparing for the immediate future, and the committee will be aware of the Simplification Task Force, a report which I have here and which was published just yesterday. Previous evidence sessions considered whether the powers in Part 1 of the bill could be used to completely replace or radically change the retained CAP legislation if the government saw fit. This is not the case. It's clear the scope limits changes to simplification or improvements. And let me be clear, the Scottish Government intention is to use the powers in Part 1 to ensure that the CAP can continue after 2020, to make the CAP easier to understand, and to use by simplifying and improving CAP rules, and to adapt marketing and classification rules as required. And this is all set out, Convener, on the face of the bill. Secondly, ministers are already and rightly bound by the Climate Change Emissions Reductions Target Scotland Act 2019 and by the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004. In short, ministers could not use this bill to legislate in a way that circumvented or was incompatible with key legislation protecting the environment. The bill also includes in Part 2 powers in relation to the collection and processing of data, which are also both important and necessary in regulating and developing policy for the agricultural sector. It will ensure that everything we do is consistent with the principles of the GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018. Convener, I will stop there as I believe the committee has a lot of questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The first questions are going to come from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Morning again, Cabinet Secretary and team there. Cabinet Secretary, can you outline, please, what simplifications and improvements the Scottish Government are planning to make as a result of Section 2 of the bill, please?
Well, thank you. And in response to that question, I would just refer to the report which was published yesterday. I appreciate, Convener, that that means that members are unlikely to have had an opportunity to study it. And this sets out a number of areas in where I do think that there is a relative consensus, Convener, that there are potential for simplification and improvement amongst the wider rural community. And then perhaps I could just outline some of the areas and then go back to questions if that's appropriate. Improve mapping, mapping stability during SAF process, penalties, and penalties is for me is an absolutely key to make the system, I think, more proportionate, less unduly onerous. Inspections charter, the standardisation of capital grant rates, improvement of EU appeals processing performance or post-EU appeals processing performance, improving understanding, communication, education, and those are 7 areas in which the task force convener set out its initial thoughts. It's the basis for further policy work and development, and I think it points us in the right direction. What I would say is that all these things are adjective, not substantive. They're about procedure, not substance. They're about how we implement policies. They're not about the substance of the policies themselves, and therefore I think they are germane to the powers in this bill, which are substantially not about, what we do and what the policies are for the environment, Mr. Finney, but how we implement them and make sure that they're implemented effectively, they do what they're supposed to do, that there are checks and balances to make sure people don't abuse the system, but that they're treated fairly at the same time in respect of if they make a mistake, they're not treated as though they were some kind of criminal.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that, Cabinet Secretary. And as you say, it's just a recent publication. I haven't had the opportunity to digest it as yet. I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, would you think that the interpretation of the terms simplification and improvement may indeed be subjective? So can I ask, when these terms are used, as determined by whom and based on what would you use these terms, please?
Well, I think the term simplification is one that we kind of all understand, but although I am a lawyer, I'm not really here as a lawyer, so I have the luxury of passing to a lawyer to help us out, because I think, to be serious, this is a question of draftsmanship, perhaps legal draftsmanship, and the words that are used in the legislation. So perhaps I could ask if Mr. McLennan can add anything to what I've said.
Only that I agree, yes. Those are subjective terms, but it's a case of ministerial judgment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I was quite taken in the simplification and improvement about auditing and starting off by self-audit to make sure that they complied with schemes. So, Jamie, did you want to come in briefly on
off the back of that? Yes.
Sorry?
Off the back of John Finney's questions. Yes, thank you for allowing a supplementary to that, those questions. In his evidence, Johnny Hall from NFUS made quite an interesting statement about the interpretation of simplification and improvement. And he said that the move from simplification to improvement is a slightly grey area. He agrees that the interpretation of improvement involves looking at policy rather than operation. Simplification is all about the operation of existing schemes. And that is what we're talking about when we talk about simplification. So there is some concern that the inclusion of the language improvement does actually stray into the area of alternative policies, which in the Cabinet Secretary's opening statement said that was not the point of the bill. So how will he address that when the bill comes back to us?
Well, I mean, I think, as Mr. McLennan has said, these terms are subjective. I mean, people can see these things differently and interpret them differently. I think that's undoubtedly correct. But then again, I think it is pretty clear that most people would see that if we liberalise the penalty regime, that would be a simplification and an improvement. But that's my postulation. However, with regard to the word improvement, I wonder if again we could seek some legal advice from Mr. McLennan about the use of that word in the bill.
Again, these are sort of they're drafting points about what the bill is intended to do, and I think the word improvement is hopefully narrow enough that it explains what the policy intention behind the bill is, and beyond that it is. But
it clearly doesn't. It clearly isn't narrow enough, because the legal language that the lawyers have afforded the bill represent the policy intention that the ministers have directed, whereas the ministers directing have said that that's not the policy intention of the bill, so the legal language doesn't reflect the policy intention in this instance.
I think it might be easier if one of the policy officials spoke to policy intention of the bill. Happy to pass over.
Lots of passing going on.
So I think it's a fair question in terms of the intent. The intent here from the clear intent that we've been given in the policy set out when we published the Simplicity and Stability consultation was to have a period during which farmers and crofters in Scotland have some certainty around about what they're going to be, what the support they're going to get is, and it's to continue with a system very much based on their current understanding of the system as it exists today. Where possible, we will seek to improve that in being able to conduct the process as smoothly as possible and to make it as fit for purpose as we can during the time in which we prepare for a future policy. So I think that Mr Hall's representation to the committee is not quite correct in that regard. We're not intending to introduce any new policy substance, but we are intending to improve the process, particularly given that the current legislation is quite broad in scope in terms of the sorts of objectives that we're seeking to achieve. So we're providing income support to farmers whilst at the same time trying to derive environmental benefits. So those are principles that we would still continue to enact in the way that we use the legislation that we'll bring forward under this bill.
You wanted to come in?
I thought actually I might be able to help Mr Green out by looking at sections 2 and 6 of the bill. Sections 2 and 6 are the sections which, as far as I can see, refer to powers to simplify or improve CAP legislation. And if one looks at the wording deployed in section 2, and I think I've just checked in section 6 as well, which I won't read out, but it's similar, it says that Scottish ministers may only make modifications that they consider would simplify or improve the operation of the provisions of the legislation. So those two words, simplify or improve, must be read in the light that they're qualified by what they are designed to simplify or improve. And in this case, it is simplify or improve the operation of the provisions of the legislation. And I place deliberate emphasis on the word operation. I think, Convener, I mean, we can discuss this at stage 2 if Parliament so wishes in amendments, and that I think is right and proper. Maybe we're starting to move on to a stage 2 type debate, I don't know, but I think my reading of this is that Mr Hall's concerns do not apply because of the particular mode of drafting, that we've made it clear that the improvement refers to improving how it works, not what it does.
Right.
And moreover, you know, there might be a sub-argument that simplify implies improve. I mean, some people would say if you simplify something that's complex, then inherently there is an improvement. I certainly would. But I think the feeling was that we needed, for the avoidance of doubt, to use both simplify or improve as signifying what we seek to do here. But what we seek to do, and if we have had any infelicitous draftsmanship, then, you know, Parliament's processes allow us, Convener, to correct that at stage 2. That's what it's for. And I'm very happy to come back to that. But I do think that Mr Hall's criticism is not quite apt in that regard.
I think then we'll move on to Colin. You had some questions. Colin.
Convener, can I just follow up on that? I think Ms McClelland's clear that ultimately, whatever terms we use, simplify or improve, they will be subject to ministerial interpretation. And even the smallest changes on operational issues can have a significant impact on farmers. So is the government satisfied that the bill provides sufficient consultation procedures to allow that consultation effectively to take place when it does come to any simplifications or improvements, however you decide to interpret those phrases?
Do you have any example in mind?
I don't. I mean, well, you haven't. Apart from the document that was published yesterday, there haven't been any proposals. But I'm assuming that as a result of this bill and the fact we're having this bill, the government will ultimately put forward proposals for simplification and improvements. And it's just that, and we don't know what they are yet. And I'm sure people have questions as to the lack of direction when it comes to some of these so far. But the fundamental principle is that whatever proposals you put forward for either simplification or improvement, does the bill provide for sufficient consultation on those changes?
Well, you know, we will have we will take steps to make sure that there is sufficient consultation of those who are closely involved with this, obviously, and we, with respect, we already have actually. I mean, if you look at Annex 1, the task force members of the Simplification Task Force, chaired by Douglas Petrie, the head of area offices and head of agricultural profession, we've got SAC, NFUS, various solicitors in experience in agri-law, Crofting Federation, a SNH, young monitor farmers, forestry experts. We did seek, convener, to reach out to rural communities and experts to inform the useful work that's been done in this report so far. So, obviously we will proceed by consultation, including, of course, in discussions and debates in this Parliament, both here and in plenary sessions. So that's something that we routinely do as is appropriate. But I don't know we're here really to discuss the government's overall policy and consultation, but basically it's that we work in tandem with stakeholders, and of course it makes sense to properly consult where appropriate.
The question was really just, is there a legal underpinning within the bill to ensure that happens? But just moving on to the issue of that direction as to what potential changes could be. A number of stakeholders in their evidence have said that a statement of purpose clause to the face of the bill would help to clarify the limit of the powers it confers, particularly in relation to the powers to simplify and improve retained CAP legislation in Section 2. Would you give consideration to an amendment being made to the bill along those lines? And if you don't support that, what particular reasons do you have for that?
Well, I think it would be imprudent for me to start to say whether I approve of an amendment I haven't seen, and I'm not going to do that. What I would say is that it's my absolute belief that there is an overwhelming desire amongst farmers and crofters and the wider rural community that we simplify and improve the operation of the provisions of the schemes, and that's an overwhelming desire. And I have to say, in particular, convener, I have to just make this short. It's 20 years as an MSP. Some of the penalties imposed on farmers and crofters, to me, have been utterly disproportionate, but ones where there has been no discretion under the penalty regime that has been in place, but to impose. And I do think that that's something that we do need to put right. And I hope that if members agree with me, that we will agree that it's necessary for the Scottish Government to be able to do that as swiftly and as simply as possible.
Okay, well, I think the desire from stakeholders was that setting out a purpose for grants that the government provide would provide that sort of reassurance and direction as to what the ultimate policy aims are of the bill itself. But looking at another issue that's came up from stakeholders, and I think you touched on this in your opening statement, Cabinet Secretary, when you talked about the environment, but it probably goes wider than that. But the evidence that we've had from some stakeholders is that, again, a change to the bill could very well be to add a no regression clause, which would ensure that any simplification or improvements introduced using the powers in Section 2 don't have a regressive impact, for example, either in the environment or another area is, of course, animal welfare. But is the idea of a no regression clause something that the government have given consideration to when developing the bill? And if not, is that something you would consider going forward when we look to amend the bill?
Which bit? Well, I mean, I think I have, to start off with, addressed in my opening statement the fact that Parliament has passed a legislation in respect of climate change and the environment, and we are bound by that. And therefore, nothing in this bill can regress from that. I mean, we have to comply with that. So, I will look carefully at Stage 2 if we get to that stage, as I hope we will, to consider this further, but I do think that this is primarily an issue that we might want to take up with the UK government, because I think the particular concern at the moment is that in Brexit we depart from the high standards of animal hygiene, animal welfare that have been in place thanks to the EU law on these matters, and the lack of an absolute commitment that there will be a sort of equivalence undertaking. And in fact, I quizzed Theresa Villiers on this on Monday, along with Rosanna Cunningham and Marie Goujon. And Rosanna Cunningham asked if there would be a specific legislative undertaking that there would be no regression. And there will not be, according to the UK government's plans. There will simply be a requirement to lay a report before the UK Parliament. So, you know, with respect, I think the biggest threat to regression is the one that I've outlined.
And I wouldn't disagree with you, Cabinet Secretary, that should be implemented by the UK Government. But in the absence of that, surely it then falls on the Scottish Government to make sure that we do not have, we have a no regression policy when it comes to issues such as animal welfare, that we should not be making changes to our payments, for example, that in any way adversely impacts on animal welfare. And surely there's a debate and discussion to be had about whether that would be helped by having a legal underpinning to that.
Well, this is a framework bill with a very specific purpose to allow us to change the operation of current CAP schemes. That will not and does not involve changing this government's policy on environmental or animal welfare standards. And these policies are very clear and have been enunciated very clearly by members of the Scottish Government. So, you know, I think there is a risk of conflating this bill, which deals with procedural issues, with the substantive policy issues. But I don't accept that this bill carries a risk that there would be any diminution in these standards. Nor do I believe that my colleagues would have any who have other portfolio responsibilities would have any intention to do that.
Okay, I think the next questions are coming from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just first of all say that I'm fully supportive of the policy intention of the bill. My focus really is on the drafting of one particular section, Section 3, and if I can say, it runs from Section 2 as well, but can I just say that I understand why civil servants draft legislation in this way to give ministers flexibility in actually implementing the policy. But our role here in the committee is to look at the perhaps unintended consequences of legislation, because governments are not here in perpetuity and governments change, and the policy intention of a current secretary might be different from a future cabinet secretary of whichever political persuasion, or even the same political persuasion. So Section 3 says, Scottish ministers may by regulations modify the main cap legislation for the purpose of securing the provisions of the legislation continue to operate in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. Now, I know the policy intention of the Cabinet Secretary is to have a new bill come forward containing a new policy for the future of the rural economy in Scotland post-2024. So the majority of our witnesses have identified a concern that the intention to give powers for ministers these regulations to change things will last for 1 or more years beyond 2020. This gives the power to a current or future Cabinet Secretary to not implement a new scheme that comes in by 2024. It gives the power to Cabinet Secretaries to continue to use regulations to simplify and modify. And most of our witnesses have suggested that that could easily be changed to fit the purposes of the intention of the bill, to say a particular time, say not beyond 2024, to give plenty of time, up to 4 years, for this transition to be in place, because the temptation might be for a future Cabinet Secretary not to implement a new policy, bespoke policy for Scotland by that date. Are you with me, Cabinet Secretary? Do you understand my question?
I'm trying to understand it. I'm not sure that maybe it's my fault.
Maybe I rephrase it then.
Reduce the length, maybe.
Yes,
Mr.
try and keep it much shorter. Okay. The policy intention of the bill is absolutely correct. Most of our witnesses, and I agree with them, are concerned that Section 3 is not tight enough about regulations for the Cabinet Secretary, for the Scottish Government, and it will give a get-out clause to any future Cabinet Secretary, not this one, I'm absolutely certain, but any future Cabinet Secretary, to rely on changes using the regulations rather than implementing a new policy. So that the solution would be to actually limit that, say to 2024.
Because
it gives power forever, basically.
First of all, I appreciate Mr Rumble's support of the bill in principle. I appreciate his kind remarks about myself. I'd just like to make a few general remarks and then perhaps try to address the specific point about should there be some sort of time limit, sunset clause or restriction. Put simply, we won't make major changes without appropriate consultation and engagement. We always do that. We come to Parliament and we're held to account by this committee constantly. So Parliament will continue to play a significant role, and that's correct. But this section will also allow changes to be made to retained EU law by regulations, and this would require secondary legislation to be laid before the Scottish Parliament, and that in turn will give MSPs an opportunity to scrutinise, probe the changes and to hold this government to account. And we also require to consider a range of impact assessments, including business and regulatory impact assessment, and these require us to consult with stakeholders on the impact of their business. I do invite members to bear in mind that this is a framework bill which provides for the possibility of doing something rather than actually legislating for change just now. And the last point I make is that governments do need to be able to act swiftly. We do need to be able to respond swiftly. If there is primary legislation which constrains that, that means we have to come back to Parliament to amend that primary legislation. Let me just put one scenario to Mr Rumbles. Let's say a future minister decides that they want to drag their feet in climate change, and they've got to go back to seek primary legislation to make a change to improve tackling climate change. Then if I were such a minister, I would say, well, it might be difficult to find a slot. It's going to take me 3 years to tackle this. If I'm bound by primary legislation instead of being able to make changes swiftly. So, I think you can argue it from different angles here. You can say that the need to go back to get primary legislation could be used as a pretext by future government for not doing things which some members would like us to do. And that may not be, an impossibilist scenario, quite frankly. And in addition, I'll just give you another example. This is not quite the same thing, but we have acted quite swiftly over convergence payments to come up with a scheme convener, and that was done swiftly. If there's all sorts of restrictions about how governments act and so on and so forth, would we be in a position, as we now are, to say that that first payment will be made to crofters and farmers by the end of March? No, we wouldn't. And if there's corrections that need to be made to a scheme, let's say we develop a scheme and a new scheme and there's flaws in it, there's defects and there's unintended consequences, and this is part and parcel of government. It happens all the time. If we are to go back and require primary legislation to be able to correct it and make changes, then I think that process would be inappropriate. So I do feel that the arguments put forward aren't ones to which we're attracted. However, I am sure that we will come to consider this further, Convener, if, as I hope, the bill will go to stage 2, and I'm quite sure at that stage we will have a more focused and detailed debate. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr Rumbles might move some amendments. I hope he does, in a sense, because perhaps that might be the opportunity for us to consider these serious matters. I don't dismiss them in a bit more detail than perhaps we can with the time available to us today.
Can I just say, I'm actually with the Cabinet Secretary on the points that he was arguing, but the argument he made is not answering the question that I put. It's a different question. Can I just put it this way? I do not doubt the Cabinet Secretary's personal integrity on this or his intentions at all. He's an honourable individual. And his intention is to bring by 2024 a new primary legislation to Parliament. That's what he wants to do, and we're very supportive of that. But say there was a change of government next year at the election. The way the bill is written, it will allow any new government to come in 2021 and continue to modify and improve by regulation and not introduce a bespoke policy for post-2024. So Well, whether members think that's a realistic prospect or not, it is certainly in a democracy something that might happen. So our job is to make sure that the legislation that we produce is fit for purpose of any government. And therefore, the point I'm actually trying to make is, in fact, the Minister used the phrase, it would give the government an opportunity to drag their feet in implementing. But that's the point I'm actually making. If we leave it as it is, it gives any future government, not this one, but it gives any future government the opportunity to drag their feet on implementing a bespoke policy. And that actually was the fear that many of the witnesses came forward with. So what we're trying to say is, I mean, I would perhaps we could have discussions later, but I actually think it's helpful if the government brings forward amendments at stage 2 to address issues that I think we should be able to agree on.
Well, I certainly hope so, and I want to be helpful. And in that respect, I think Mr McLennan wanted to make a point about Section 3, with your permission, Convener.
Thank you. Yes, just to clarify exactly the purpose of Section 3, the CAP legislation as it exists doesn't function properly after 2020. There are some things which it wasn't intended to do after that time period, so that power simply allows us to make the modifications we require to make it work after 2020, which I hope is a helpful addition.
Just my point was, this could go on forever, and we need, if we're going to have a new bespoke policy for the future of Scottish agriculture, then we need a new bill. And if we put a limit on this, then we're going to get a new bill, because the government of whichever persuasion will have to come back. That was the point I was making. Okay.
Rich, do you want to come in briefly?
Yeah, again, I've got to say, is it not good government that they can act swiftly and do something rather than have to continually go back and change legislation every couple of years? You know, put in a piece of legislation that you can then come in with amendments. You know, people like me get frustrated with how long it takes to do something. As far as I'm concerned, I think it would be good government if we can do something swiftly. Would you agree?
Well, I do think governments need flexibility to be able to act quickly in some circumstances, and obviously in doing so we are accountable to Parliament, and we will be held up and brought to account. Of that we are absolutely sure. But that flexibility is essential to be a government and to carry out executive functions, and that, I think, is the essential point. However, you know, I'm very open to discussions about amendments at stage 2, and no doubt, Convener, those discussions will take place, and we do obviously take account of views expressed by stakeholders and the evidence that they've given already to this committee on these matters.
If I can just make an observation, because I was going to question you slightly later on the issue of a sunset clause, and maybe just say that over half the respondents that we've had, SLE, Law Society, WWF Scotland, RSPB, Soil Association, Scottish Wildlife Trust, etc., all felt there might be a reason for considering a sunset clause, and I believe you were copied in on, well, we were copied in on a letter to you, Cabinet Secretary, regarding from the DPLR committee, asking if that you would consider a sunset clause further, rather than prolonging the conversation on this. Can I just say, do you recognise there is a significant amount of people who've made this recommendation to the committee? Will you give an assurance that you will consider this further during the passage of the bill, should it go beyond this stage, which, like you, I hope it will?
Well, I've already said that we have regard and we take account of the evidence that those who have already provided evidence in writing and orally to the committee. So obviously, as a general matter, we take account of that. But I do think there's considerable uncertainty regarding the post-Brexit landscape in terms of, for example, what any future relationship with the EU may look like, the rules we may have to follow. And this could impact on our timing and ability for bringing forward a long-term policy. I do think we really need to retain flexibility to address these uncertainties. And as a matter of principle, my starting point, Convener, is that we must retain that flexibility, subject to accountability to Parliament, That is the democratic system. And if we start to constrain ministers' ability to act, we tie ourselves up in knots, or we risk tying ourselves up in knots and preventing us from being able to respond swiftly, to act where we require, or simply to act routinely to correct unintended consequences which arise from policy, particularly new policy, where we're trying to do new things to improve farming as it tackles climate change, for example. I'm sure we will do a lot more to do that, and I'm sure farmers want to. But if we tie ourselves up in knots so that we have to go back to primary legislation to be able to do the details of this work, I do feel instinctively that would be a retrograde step. But we will give these matters, and I undertake we will give these matters serious consideration at stage 2, Convener, assuming for the moment that members wish to debate them as is their right.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Richard Lyle, yours is the next question.
Yes, my question is, can you clarify what modifications, if any, the Scottish Government is intending to make to the financial provisions in the bill?
Well, again, that is a question about policy, and we're here to discuss process. So this is not a bill where we're bringing forward proposals to alter the current financial support payments. It is rather one that allows us to make changes to the existing schemes and give us the power to do that. But Mr. Lyle is quite right that these matters are extremely important, and I should say, of course, that as mandated by Parliament and in the motion which was amended by Mr. Rumbles, the Farming and Food Production Advisory Group is working hard and is due to provide us with recommendations in due course. And it's right that we have regard to the work that they and others do, and other work, before we come forward with proposals. But with respect, I don't think that that's the primary purpose of this bill.
Right, so I'm taking that on board. So it's wrong for people to suggest that you're considering any proposals to transfer funds between pillars?
Well, we do at the moment have a transfer. I think it's 9.5% from Pillar 1, Pillar 2. There are different levels of degression, I think is the word, from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 applicable throughout the UK. And again, this is an area where flexibility, I think, is an advantage. It allows us to act swiftly in that regard.
In regard to certain stakeholders have underlined the importance of giving the sector plenty advance notice of changes to be introduced using the powers conferred by Section 3(4) of the bill in particular. What level of proprietary consultation do you plan to undertake before exercising these powers?
Well, as a matter of practice, we always wish to have due, appropriate consultation depending upon how significant something is. That's something that we always do, and I undertake we'll continue to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter Chapman, I think you've got the next questions, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. As you know, Cabinet Secretary, the bill allows for pilot schemes to test new payment regimes, and I'm sure you also know that the farming community are desperate for some clarity as to what is likely to happen. So, can I ask, when will the Scottish Government be in a position to share some more detail concerning the types of pilots it intends to introduce and the intended objectives of these?
We set out our policy in our document published in, I believe it was June 2017's Stability and Simplicity, and that it was designed to provide just that. The primary thing, I think, Mr. Chapman, that in my perspective at least, that farmers wanted was an element of stability and certainty, particularly in relation to direct income payments. And I'm pleased, I think, that that overall we've been able to do that. I think that's pole position, really, for farmers and crofters. There's so many uncertainties about Brexit that they wanted reasonable certainty about money continuing to come in. And, I think I've rightly devoted a lot of effort to that. However, we think that pilots are a useful method of exploring how we can deliver policy changes and improvements in future. And there's a whole host of things that are already going on, and I'm sure Mr. Chapman is aware of that. For example, in agronomy in respect of improved culture of grass, in respect of better use of rotations for better production of silage, in respect of the use of hydrogen in order to provide renewable energy on the farm, in respect of different feedstuffs for cattle to reduce methane and to improve the digestive tract. I've spoken to many farmers and monitor farms throughout the country. In Aberdeenshire, actually, I think it was last Monday when I visited 2 farms and also visited ANM. There are also improvements in respect of EID and particularly the opportunities to improve safety in terms of use of EID and readers to reduce the incidence of injury or worse in respect of the close proximity handling of particularly cattle. So I just list some of the things that are in fact already going on, and we want to build on the good work that's doing. And the last thing I would say is we particularly want to tackle the increasing desire amongst, I think, society as a whole that the good practice in farming for climate change should be substantially improved. That's an area where I think we need to focus on, and that is an area ripe, I think, for developing potential pilot schemes in future. In developing these pilot schemes, I don't really think, and this is the last thing I'll say, Convener, I appreciate it's a long answer. I appreciate that, you know, Mr. Chapman is asking me for the answers. To me, it's the other way around. I go around the country asking farmers, what do you think the answer is? I think that's the best way to come up with policy. And that's how we approach the task of deciding and devising how we spend, you know, valuable time and resource of public officials and public money in deciding what pilot schemes to pursue. And that's the approach that we're taking thus far. So, you know, that's a general answer I appreciate, but I hope it is of some assistance. But the last point I make is that this is not the purpose of this bill. These are all substantive policy questions.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what the Cabinet Secretary says, but I do absolutely believe that the farming industry out there are desperately looking for some clarity as to what the thoughts are going forward. And you know, while taking evidence on this bill, the committee has heard a variety of stakeholders arguing for quite radical reform to the way that farm payments are calculated and allocated. For instance, moving away from an area-based approach towards an activity-based approach. So, I mean, I wonder, is the Scottish Government sympathetic to that view, and does it have plans to begin trialling a new approach to the calculation and allocation of farm payments using the powers within this bill between the 2021-24 period? Because I think it's desperately important that we do get some clarity. You know, we've got a focus on a 75% reduction in CO2 emissions to 2030. And if little changes between now and 2024, that just allows 6 years left for the industry to make these pretty radical changes, I would argue. So I'm concerned that we aren't moving quickly enough to find a way forward and to allow the industry to see the way that we're planning to go forward, or this government sees the way that the industry needs to go forward.
Well, you know, I don't disagree with everything that Mr. Chapman has said there, and you know, I do think I would point out, incidentally, that the existing direct support payments are conditional upon a certain minimum level of activity. So it's not as if the system says you get the money and you don't need to do anything. I mean, it's not as simple as that, as Mr. Chapman well knows. But I think there is a case for moving to a system where there is a better linkage between the provision of direct financial support and outcomes. But, you know, I always like to try and defend farmers here, because I think farmers are already providing public goods. There's a narrative down south that we need to get out of the EU for farmers to do good things. No, no, no. Farmers are already doing good things. They're already providing our food, and they're already looking after the landscape, and they're already pillars of the rural communities. So they're already providing public goods. But I do agree that there is more that can be done, and in particular, we want to focus on how farming can adapt towards meeting the challenges of climate change. And I can assure Mr. Chapman that's an area where we're looking very closely at.
But can you give me any sort of timescale as to when we're likely to see what these pilots might look like? I know they're not going to be the end product, because the very description of a pilot means it's a trial and error sort of thing. But Can you give us some ideas as a timescale to see some of these pilots?
Well, I think that's a matter. I'm happy to come back to committee and discuss it in a forum where this is the topic for discussion. But frankly, it's not the topic for discussion today. It's about a bill which is about the mechanism. So I'm very happy to come back and address that. But what I would say is that at the moment, it actually would be imprudent to come up with a series of finalised post-Brexit policies, because we don't know what Brexit's going to do. We don't know if there's going to be tariffs at 50% on sheep meat. 88% of our sheep meat exports go to the EU. 88%. If there are tariffs because there's no effective trade deal by the end of December, what do we do then? What support will we need to provide to our sheep farmers then? Secondly, we don't know if there will be equivalents for imported beef from the Americas. Beef that is reared without any regard, as we would see it, for animal welfare and proper regulation, never mind provenance. So, with respect, Convener, until these big macro issues about trade, about exports, about economics are sorted, it would actually be imprudent for any government to finalise a set of policies, because we don't know the scenario, the factual scenario that these policies have to address. Nor will we know that until the end of December. Be that as it may, however, that's not stopping us from doing the work. We're carrying on doing the preparatory work, and I'm delighted that the relevant report for today, this one, has already pointed us in the right direction in matters germane to this bill.
Cabinet Secretary, I think what committee members are trying to do, and I may have misunderstood this, is this bill is largely about process, as you've made entirely clear. I think committee members are trying to find out what those processes will be used for. And so you have another question.
Just one more question.
And then there's a few supplementaries.
I have one more question, Convener, and it's about funding. And my understanding is that the UK government has guaranteed the same level of funding for the lifetime of that Westminster Parliament, and I assume you accept that as well. But my question is whether the Scottish Government is committed to co-financing at the same level as is currently provided, because as you well know, Pillar 2 schemes are co-financed by EU monies at the moment and partly by Scottish Government money. So is there a commitment from Scottish Government to continue the co-financing of Pillar 2 schemes at the same level as we see just now?
Well, this is a complex area, and it's an area where I'm happy to provide a bit more detail to committee. Recently, we have, in the Scottish Government, received a letter from the Treasury, and Mr Mackay has received that letter. Now, that letter says that funding will be provided at a certain specific level this year, but it doesn't, for example, confirm the convergence money. It doesn't make any reference to that, so we need to sort that out. It says that we must absorb and accept the fixing of the budget at a certain exchange rate. It is not clear to us whether that will result possibly in a diminution of funds. We're not certain about that. We're probing that with the UK government. It raises other questions about the wording used in the letter. Therefore, whereas I welcome any further clarity, and I accept that there has been some movement towards that, Mr Chapman, it would be wrong for me to accept the proposition to which you put unqualified, because I can't, and I don't think the facts support that at the moment. But we do want to get to that situation. Moreover, the letter says that the assurances apply for this financial year, but expressly do not cover future financial years, although I've heard that the intention is to do that. But that's different from an absolute assurance. So I think we have to pursue this in a forensic way, and that's the way to do it. However, all of that said, probably there's nobody in this planet that has probed directly and questioned Michael Gove, and he was the DEFRA Minister for most of the last 3 years, than me, on exactly this question. I've been asking him face to face for the last 3 years, since the Brexit referendum, will you match the money as you promised before the Brexit referendum? Will you match the EU funds post-Brexit, yes or no? And frankly, for 3 years, we never got an answer to that question in full. If the UK government are now finally getting around to giving us that belated assurance, no one will be more happy than me.
But the specific part of the question was whether the Scottish Government is committed to co-financing Pillar 2 schemes. I mean, that's a decision for the Scottish Government rather than the Westminster Government.
Yeah, well, we have no intention to cease to co-finance in general government schemes. No intention at all. I've had nothing but complete support from Mr Mackay. Frankly, in all the asks that I've made, and bear in mind that it's prudent for ministers to be careful for what demands they make of a Finance Secretary in order to act maturely and responsibly. I was delighted that Mr Mackay agreed that the convergence monies be used entirely for agriculture and not, as some crofters put to me in Lochaber when I was at the Lochaber show in August, oh, you'll siphon the money off for the health service. He didn't. He gave me a copper plate assurance and he's delivering on that. So I have every faith in Mr Mackay and that he will continue to be supportive to the rural communities in future as he has been in the past.
Stuart Stevenson.
I think there are probably short answers to my two questions, Convener. The first of them relates to the pilots. I presume the intention is for many, if not necessarily all of the pilots, they are a necessary precursor to developing a future agriculture bill, which will start to change policy. And the other part is just simply, if, as a matter of fact, you're able to tell the committee how long it took to develop the current CAP scheme, to give us some sort of understanding of the scale of effort that is involved in producing new agricultural support schemes, because I think it's pretty clear that we don't want to create a new scheme in a very short period of time, only to find that we haven't taken the time to think through the issues.
How long has it taken to formulate the CAP? I think we're talking multiples of decades, but without being frivolous, I think there's a very serious point here, that one reason why it's sensible to proceed by way of pilots is to try things out properly in a controlled fashion and carefully, to be able to monitor their efficacy and to do so on a relatively limited basis. And that means that one can ensure that usually those who are most enthusiastic about something try it out and see if they can make it work. If they can make it work, all in good. If they can't, then who can? And secondly, the benefit of a pilot is that, as opposed to a brand new scheme, if you get something wrong, well, you've tried it, but it doesn't work. If you put in a whole brand new scheme without trying it out first, then you've got a much bigger problem. And thirdly, the benefit of pilots is this, that the lead-in time for changing substantially any policy, or certainly a brand new policy, is long. And that's because one has to formulate the policy, consulting, as we've agreed to do, with stakeholders. You have to determine the policy. It's a difficult process. Then you have to proof check it to make sure it's going to work okay. Then you have to commission IT to be able to operate it on the CAP payment system. And all of that has to be done, frankly, before you can implement it. You have to design the forms. You have to make sure they're comprehensible, as simple as possible, and compatible with the computer system. You have to make sure it's compatible with the LPIS, Land Parcel Information Service, probably in most cases. All of that means that devising new policy is something that one has to be done with great care. And we're talking certainly a minimum, I would think, of a year or so in respect of bringing in new policies. And the risk is that because of enthusiasm to do the right thing, or because of stakeholder pressure to do the right thing, that governments are tempted to try to do the right thing and do it too quickly before we're ready to actually implement it. And I'm not willing to expose the rural community to those risks. Therefore, that's why I've taken the approach in the work that I've done as Cabinet Secretary, particularly in stability and simplicity, in making it clear that we need to approach with care. In short, the approach is festina lenti.
Mike Rumbles, you have some questions.
Following up on that very point that Stuart's made and the Cabinet Secretary has responded to, really Peter Chapman's point about pilot schemes, in addition to all that the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, and I just think it's important to manage expectations here. The Cabinet Secretary just said a year or so for policy. Actually, if we think through the process, surely the Future Foreign Policy Group need to make that their report to the Cabinet Secretary, and then that needs to be interrogated before anybody can start thinking of pilot schemes, surely. So actually a year or so is quite short term. I actually think, aren't we working towards 2024 for the implementation of a new policy? And I think if people expect a new policy before that time to be implemented, I think that's very, that would be difficult in managing those expectations, surely.
Well, you know, spoken like a potential government minister, I may say.
I don't think there's any chance of that, Mr. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, who knows? But to be serious, no, I think Mr. Rummels makes a perfectly valid point. Although I would say that, you know, I think we are able to go ahead with some pilots to try things out. And indeed, you know, I've just brought to my attention that there are some examples of pilot schemes that have been done. You know, POBAS, the SNH, piloting an outcome-based approach to agri-environment in Scotland, explores a payment by results-based approach to delivering agri-environment schemes. And there's groups of farmers in Skye, Strathspey, Argyll and East Lothian involved. So I think actually it probably is possible to do pilots without the Farming and Food Production Advisory Group's report. But I do agree that I don't think we can finalise policy until they've opined. But nor do I think that it's possible to finalise a policy anyway because of the tariff and trade issues that remain unresolved, and which, if they're not resolved in an acceptable way, may lead us to have to think very radically about how we tackle an entirely different situation. This world has taken free trade and frictionless trade for granted for decades. But now it looks to me, with what's happening in the USA, with 25% tax on exports there to whisky, cashmere and shortbread, three iconic Scottish products, and what's may happen, I hope won't, in respect of Brexit, you know, we have to tack tent.
Before we move on to the next question, I'm going to make a plea to committee members and to the Cabinet Secretary. I'm always aware that my job as convener is to try and make sure that everyone has a chance to answer all the questions that they want to ask, and for the Cabinet Secretary to answer as fully as possible. Therefore, short questions, short answers help me to make sure that you don't have to come and complain to me that I've ignored you at the end, committee members. So I just make that plea, and I'm sure you'll take it to heart. Angus, yours are the next questions.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you announced on the 24th of October last year that the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme would not be open to new applicants from 2020. So we'd be interested to hear if other schemes will also be affected. And does the Scottish Government intend to use the powers in this bill to ensure that funding is available for AEX and all other current schemes beyond 2020?
Well, we have supported environmental schemes through a whole variety of ways. I think it's sometimes neglected that the greening element in the Pillar 1 payment is designed to do that, and as indeed are some of the rules which are applicable in respect of the direct payment schemes. I think my officials will cover the specific detail about the AIC scheme. I don't know whether it's Mr. Kerr or Mr. Burgess will do that, please.
So, in terms of the AIC scheme, one of the issues that we have with that particular support is that the contracts issued under AICs are multi-annual, and of course we don't have any certainty around about the nature of the funding beyond, as Cabinet Secretary has already said, beyond 2020. So decisions about further AIC rounds will have to be taken once we've got a clearer sense of what the financial picture is in terms of the support that we receive after we've left the European Union, in terms of the quantum of a sum available to have the means with which to deliver that support.
Okay, and with regard to any other current schemes?
So as we discussed with the committee late last year, we have set out our plans for the Pillar 2 elements of the funding for the remaining part of the programme, and there were no other particular changes of the nature that you suggest.
Okay, that's fine, thanks. So is it still the Scottish Government's intention to use capping of individual payments as a mechanism for funding pilot schemes to be introduced using the powers in this bill? And if that's the case, how far has the Scottish Government developed its thinking in this area, and when will it be in a position to reveal a finalised policy on capping?
Okay, well, if I can start off by answering that and say that we are looking at capping payments, and indeed Mr MacDonald and members will know that that was stated in the Stability and Simplicity consultation, and there's a reasonable amount of detail in that document there and end. And we confirmed this again in the programme for government by saying we would develop substantive measures ready for implementation in 2021. So this will include the level at which the largest direct payments made to individual recipients will be capped in order to redistribute the funds elsewhere within the cap support. There are, by way of background, a large number of diverse views on cappings and its pros and cons. It's a very controversial topic. Let's not make no bones about it. But there is a strong view that monies freed up from capping should be directed towards other positive schemes. I'm not going to suggest schemes now because this is really policy, not process. But the majority view, I think, is that there should be a cap in one form or another. Lastly, I should say I think there is a cap in place in respect of direct payments, basic payments in Pillar 1. It's a pretty high level at the moment, and I think there's a majority view that it does require to be looked at. And there are also technical issues about avoidance and anti-avoidance measures in respect of businesses and whether a group of businesses are actually controlled by one actual business. And these are things which governments have to bear in mind when we're looking at an issue which is inherently complex, controversial, but nonetheless one where we have given a clear direction of travel and an indication about when we hope we will be able to take a different approach, which I've indicated.
Okay, so do you have a timeline for the finalised policy?
Well, our commitment in the programme for government is to develop substantive measures ready for implementation in 2021.
Thank you. The next lot of questions coming from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. We're moving on to Section 5, the power to modify CAP legislation on public intervention and private storage aid. And I'll maybe try and wrap up two questions into one. So, is the Scottish Government planning to make any changes to the ability of the Scottish Government to intervene in exceptional circumstances? And how do you respond to the assertion from some stakeholders that the Brexit process in itself constitutes an exceptional circumstance during which the governments may need to intervene? And I mean, we talked about possible tariffs that sheep farmers may face. Is that an exceptional circumstance?
Right. Well, we aren't, in response to the first question about whether we would intervene in exceptional circumstances, no, we are not planning to make any such changes. I'm told the purpose of this section of the bill is to prevent Scottish ministers being obliged to intervene in a market in Scotland when the Secretary of State is not so obliged in England or elsewhere in the UK. So there's a somewhat technical reason behind that. Secondly, that the argument that Brexit in itself constitutes exceptional circumstances. We do agree that the sort of market dislocation to which I've already alluded that Brexit could lead to, and we hope it won't, but could amount to exceptional circumstances. And I think the examples I've given, I won't rehash them, Convener, would, I think, to most people's way of thinking, be exceptional circumstances. So we had already looked at in the no-deal Brexit preparations and a compensation scheme for sheep meat in the event that tariffs at 40–50% were imposed on lamb. And indeed, we in the NFU and the NFUS pressed the UK government going back to, I think, the autumn of 2017 on these matters, and we had worked up in principle a scheme that would apply. So that's an example of some kind of response that I think would have been appropriate, albeit that I think many people feel that compensation schemes have two facets about them: too little, too late.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The next questions are from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Almost good afternoon, everybody. I'm interested in Section 6 of the bill, and Section 6 gives Scottish ministers powers by regulations to amend the conditions for aid to fruit and vegetable producer organisations, which they consider would simplify or improve this legislation. I know we need to give producers a good, strong voice. Sometimes they are at the bottom end of the supply chain when it comes to decisions. I'm interested if you're able to outline, Cabinet Secretary, what the Scottish Government's overall approach to producer organisations is, and confirm what changes the Scottish Government may be planning to make to any conditions for aid to fruit and vegetable producers.
Well, we are supportive of POs and producer organisations. We think they do a good job for many sectors of the Scottish rural economy, and indeed I've had the opportunity to visit several POs and see at first hand the good work that they do in specialist areas. And 3 POs actually receive funding through a funding scheme: Angus Growers, East of Scotland Growers, and Scottish Borders Produce. And the EU Fruit and Veg Aid Scheme officially recognised POs formed on the initiative of a group of growers to receive financial assistance, and it was designed to increase competitiveness in the supply chain. For example, Highland Grains, which I visited, have developed a very efficient system of storage of barley at the correct temperature to meet the needs of whisky consumers, something which probably would have been beyond the financial capability of individual barley farmers to do. So clubbing together for a common purpose, I think, is something that we wish to support. Just one further point I may make, in the Ag Bill, the UK Ag Bill, the UK Government has asserted that the fundamental recognition of POs is a reserved matter. But as we set out in the LCM, which the Scottish Government produced for the previous UK Ag Bill, when it was previously introduced, we don't agree with that position, and that was a fundamental difference between us and the UK Government, which unfortunately we haven't been able to resolve, despite repeatedly pressing Michael Gove, Theresa Villiers and George Eustace on this matter. And it's very unfortunate, I think, because we think we're better placed here to help POs develop further in future, and possibly further new POs in areas where there is not currently a service of POs in the rural sector.
Mm-hmm. On that topic, we did take evidence that supported a producer organisation model for beef, for instance, and we already have dairy producer organisations, which, as the Cabinet Secretary will be well aware, that the dairy farming is extremely important economically for the southwest of Scotland. So will the Government have plans to maybe look at expanding producer organisation models to other areas, other sectors?
Well, we're certainly keen where there is a desire and a demand amongst the grassroots for POs to do that. I don't think it's for us to impose, but where there's a desire, and certainly the dairy sector is very, very important to the Scottish Government and to the south of Scotland and other parts of Scotland in particular. So we're happy to work with farming community and others to explore whether that is something that we should pursue, and if so, we would start off from being favourable in our approach toward that and desire to be helpful as far as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The next questions come from Jamie Green. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon to everyone properly. I'll try and keep... It is now. Sections 8 and 9, marketing standards. I have some fairly simple questions. The first one really is why the Government would like to include powers to amend marketing standards for products sold in Scotland, and why it's for products sold in Scotland, not products which originate from Scotland?
Well, it's not, firstly, our intention to make any radical changes to marketing standards, and maybe it's helpful if I just start off with that. The power being taken here is to make sure we have the ability to replicate changes made elsewhere in the UK in order to avoid barriers to the movement and sale of goods within the UK after EU exit. And such decisions can be taken on a case-by-case basis regarding whether to follow any changes made by a UK bill or whether to retain alignment with EU standards. So, again, Convener, the provision in the bill is designed to ensure the ability to do something rather than to decide policy itself.
So you can give us an example of a product which is currently sold in Scotland where there may be divergence of marketing standards between the rest of the UK and Scotland. Have any scenarios been worked up just to illustrate why the power is needed? That could be open to anyone on the panel.
Yeah, George is keen to come in.
Keen might be an exaggeration. At the moment, of course, because these standards are determined at European level, and indeed, as we discussed previously, some of them are developed at an international level, there isn't really any divergence at the moment. What we are doing here is taking a power that will protect us against the situation where under the UK government's previous agriculture bill, which we expect to be introduced anytime soon, powers are taken there to alter marketing standards, and that opened up the prospect of divergence within the UK because changes had been made in other parts of the UK that we were not able to replicate. So actually the measures here are about avoiding divergence or unintended divergence within the UK. To pick up your initial question as well about why is this about products marketed rather than produced, obviously the marketing standards apply at the point of marketing. So any producer is having to produce to the standards appropriate to the jurisdiction in which their products are going to be sold. So, a Scottish producer selling to the United States has to market and label according to the United States standards, not just to our standards. So that's the same approach will be seen in the UK government's previous agriculture bill. The marketing standards apply in the jurisdiction where the products are being marketed.
I'm struggling just in light of your answer. I was hoping to keep this brief, but you've raised a doubt in my mind as to why the intention of this is to avoid divergence of standards when actually all the evidence, sorry, not all, because I would need to check that, but the majority of evidence we've received expresses concern that this would create divergence. So again, on a technical level, could you explain why this would avoid divergence across different parts of the UK, with in effect, if you have the power to diverge those standards in Scotland or regulate divergence of standards in Scotland versus other parts of the UK, in effect it would create divergence. I struggle to understand that.
Okay. If I take the example that the UK bill, as previously proposed, as likely to be reintroduced, passes and becomes law, that creates power for marketing standards to be changed in England, in Wales and in Northern Ireland. If there was no equivalent provision in Scotland, it would be possible for marketing standards in those other parts of the UK to be changed in a way that we could not replicate. So that, without any action on the part of the Scottish ministers, would lead to the divergence. So this allows us, if you like, to play catch-up with other parts of the UK. So without these provisions, we get divergence. With these provisions, we can avoid divergence. There is an opportunity for ministers in each jurisdiction to decide what to do. I think you've seen the views from stakeholders about the importance of convergence and maintaining alignment. But if other parts of the UK and DEFRA have signalled some intentions to change marketing standards that might diverge from the European standards, that's the thing that would create the divergence, not any action that we're proposing to take.
The obvious solution to that, however, would be Scotland's inclusion in the UK agriculture bill as opposed to separate legislation.
Not necessarily, because the the way that the UK Agriculture Bill certainly previously was framed, and we would expect the same to appear now, is not a single unified marketing standards power, but actually 3 separate sets of standards. So the UK Agriculture Bill recognises for Wales and Northern Ireland the devolved nature of this, and enshrines that in legislation. So the approach that has been taken here, because marketing standards are a devolved matter, it's appropriate for it to be this Parliament that considers it, rather than delegating that to Westminster.
Thank you. And I'm sure that's a matter that will arise as the bill progresses, so I won't labour that point. It is probably worth, as you say, noting the concerns raised by stakeholders as we approach our stage 1 drafting, that there is, I would say, perhaps genuine concern that there should be no inconsistency in standards, given that the UK is the largest market for the majority of Scottish-produced products, so as long as that is being addressed. On section 9, it's more of a technical question. Could somebody on the panel explain why pig and sheep meat has been excluded from section 9 of the bill? It had been noted a few times in various evidence sessions.
Well, I'm told that the list in section 9.1 reflects what's currently in the EU CMO regulation. I don't know if George wants to come in again now that he's broken his duck, as it were.
He does. Yeah. I don't think duck is covered by the standards. Perhaps not poultry meat. Precisely as the Cabinet Secretary has said, the coverage for our provisions, and indeed the similar provisions in the UK Agriculture Bill, directly mirror the coverage of the existing EU standards. There is a power in section 9.2 for the list of sectors to be expanded, but that, as per previous discussions, would be a matter for consultation with stakeholders as to whether there was a desire for any other sector to come in under the marketing standards provisions.
That explains their omission. Maybe doesn't necessarily explain why they are omitted, but it does explain their omission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. The next questions come from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Thanks, Convener. Moving on to section 10 and carcass classifications. Following EU exit, certain stakeholders have suggested to us that the powers in section 10 of the bill offer a good opportunity to revise carcass classification to better meet the specific needs of the Scottish and UK marketplace. So is the government planning to make any changes to Scottish carcass classifications using the powers conferred in the bill, and if so, what would these look like?
Well, this power would enable us to make changes to the scales carcass classification after EU exit, and if we wish to ensure they're harmonised with those elsewhere in the UK. We did run a consultation in 2018 regarding mandatory sheep carcass classification, so further industry consultation is needed, but if we decide to make a change, this power would enable us, for example, to do that.
Okay, so consultation has taken place, but you're planning on further consultations, sorry, just to clarify.
Well, we haven't been specific, we haven't specifically consulted on these provisions, but really they're a response to the provisions that the UK government have included in its Ag Bill, and as we've set out in the policy memorandum, the risk is that if those provisions proceed for England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland could be left adrift. So it's better to take a matching set of powers here so that, if the need arises, we can make those changes.
And vice versa, of course, there were concerns from some of the evidence that we took that, if the classification changed here, it wouldn't be on a par with the rest of the UK.
Well, that would be a matter for discussion, deliberation internally as to these matters. I don't know if George has anything to add.
I think similar to the previous discussion on wider marketing standards, the same point would apply, that taking these powers would allow us to remain on all fours with the rest of the UK if that was what was wanted. Otherwise, there is the risk that changes elsewhere in the UK we would not be able to follow. I should stress, we are aware of no active plan by other parts of the UK, including DEFRA, for any specific change to the carcass classification standards. They're of pretty long standing in Europe, and it's not immediately obvious that there's a need to change them at this stage.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Angus. Richard Lyle, you had some questions. Richard.
Yes, the policy memorandum for the bill mentioned that the Scottish Government is already looking at reducing the existing burden through the use of new technology, such as Earth observation data from satellites. I'll run my two questions together. I think it's relevant to cut down the time. Is the Scottish Government planning to make any practical changes to the way that data is collected and processed? And can you elaborate on the Scottish Government's plans to introduce any new technology for data collection and processing, such as satellite mapping?
Well, the bill gives us the mechanism by which we can develop this kind of different routes. It doesn't mean new technologies or data collection methods. It could also mean a change in data processing methods. And, you know, I should emphasise generally the approach we want to take here is to be open and transparent in relation to data. I think that should be said just as a matter of principle, and for the avoidance of any doubt. I did allude to it in my opening statement, I think. But, for example, the enables data provided the farmer to be reused as long as it's within the scope of the purposes listed in the face of the bill, rather than, you know, having to ask the farmer multiple times for the same piece of data on a practical level. That sort of entitlement is, I think, a matter of common sense, and one which would be desirable for most farmers who probably think the government asks them too many questions too much of the time anyway.
That's fine. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next question is from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Okay, when asked earlier on in our evidence session, the Bill team outlined that the data collection avenues currently used by the Scottish Government, including the June and December census and the Farm Business Survey, would carry on. But do you think that the data that is currently collected is sufficient? Because during the call for views on this bill, some of the stakeholders highlighted that they felt that there are gaps in the data collected, and there may be a need to collect other data to address challenges such as climate change. So I just wonder what the Cabinet Secretary feels about, you know, whether we collect the right data and whether we collect enough data, and do we need other data streams going forward to address particularly climate change?
Well, at present, the data we currently collect is provided through Eurostat, but I think, you know, Mr. Chapman raises a perfectly reasonable point that if our sustainable development goals change in the future, then we need to make sure that we are in a position to be able to have the power to require and compel the gathering of data which is germane to pursuit of those objectives. As a general principle, I think I would agree that that is something that may require further attention in the future. And although we don't intend to change what data we collect at the moment, the powers that are set out in this bill are actually important because they allow us to respond to meet potential changes in international requirements in future. Without those powers, I think we may not be able to do that. I think Mr. McAlpine is keen now.
I think when we spoke about the Part 2 earlier, when we gave evidence, we stated that this is about personal data. So this is when we go out with surveys, and some of the work, some of the data streams that you're asking about there, that would not necessarily be personal data, so wouldn't need to actually be covered by this part of the bill. And certainly within the unit that I manage within Scottish Government, there are some teams that will work specifically on survey. This part of the bill helps them. There are other people who are looking at things like the Earth observation and other data provisions that we are going to have to look at going forward to address some of the issues that you're highlighting here through either climate change or environmental concerns or things like that. So to be very clear, that the Part 2 of the bill is enabling us to go and ask for farmers for their data, where we're looking at things like soil and earth observation. That is out with this bill. We can do that through other routes.
Okay, thank you.
Fine, perfect, thank you. Next question, I think, is from Colin Smith. Colin.
Thanks very much, Convener. A number of stakeholders have obviously pointed out that the bill doesn't have an overarching policy direction, and I think that's probably been reinforced today by the comments that any changes made by the bill are likely to be quite limited. But at the same time, given the need to reduce carbon emissions and a desire to see, for example, significant growth in Scotland's food and drink sectors, there is a clear view from stakeholders that there does need to be changes made to our rural policy. That won't happen in this legislation. So could you say what your thoughts are, Cabinet Secretary, on the timetable for future legislation is likely to be? This is clearly an interim measure, so what's your timetable for any future legislation that will set out that wider rural policy going forward in the long term?
Well, I kind of think we've broadly covered this already, but happy to answer the question, obviously, because it's been asked. This bill is not intended to set out future policy. It's set out, as I've said on numerous occasions, to set out the ability that we're able to make changes to policy and thereby develop that future policy. And without that, we would not be able to do that. I haven't said, actually, Mr. Smith, that any changes we will make will necessarily be limited. I haven't said what the changes will be because we haven't reached the point where it's appropriate for me to do so, as I've argued hitherto. However, the Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group, which is made up of external stakeholders, and I could also say it's well supported by an academic advisory panel. It's been properly resourced, I think, showing respect for Parliament and asking that it be so provided. They're currently working on future direction, and I can say they are due to report this summer. So, our focus at present is continuing wider engagement with stakeholders, that wider engagement may lead us to do further work, which is required, especially, if I may say so again, to ensure that we are in a position promptly to meet the climate change challenge. And I say that's something we're looking at in relation to additional work that we may require to do. And I think there's perhaps been a desire from stakeholders that we do that as well. So I think we need to perhaps consider supplementing the work of the Farming and Food Production Group. As a matter of fact and practice, all the time, constantly, I'm engaging with stakeholders throughout the country, and it's right that I try to do so on a regular basis. Moreover, individual farmers' businesses and farmers, crofters and businesses in rural Scotland, as recently in the excellent reception for Quality Meat Scotland yesterday evening, which I attended along with some other members here.
It's not entirely clear, though, what your preferred timetable would be for bringing forward any future legislation. Do you have a timetable in mind for that? I mean, bearing in mind that also we're going to leave the EU on the 31st of January and enter into a post-exit transition period that will end at the end of the year. But should the 2021-2024 transition period for agriculture be shortened, if you have a timetable in mind, are you able to reduce that timetable to meet any shortened transition period?
Well, the timetable, of course, is firstly in relation to this bill. We've got to take things sequentially, and I'm reminded that the timetable that we have for this bill, by which we aim that it should come into force and commencement, is this summer. At that stage, we will then be possessed of the powers that we require to move forward to the next stage. But for the reasons I've said earlier, Convener, about uncertainties in relation to Brexit, I think it would be imprudent to seek to, and wrong to seek to implement sets of new policies when we don't know what the facts are. But the preparatory work continues, and it's really that work that would then inform a timetable for any future legislative measures that are necessary, whether they be primary or secondary legislation, or an admixture of the two.
Okay, a quick question, Cabinet Secretary, that I've got. The DPLR committee, as I referred to earlier, had written to you, and one of the questions they raised about was periodic reporting to Parliament. This bill, although a process bill, does allow things to change. Is there reporting provisions that you think would be appropriate, or are we just going to work on the principle that when something happens, the government will come back to us?
I don't know if any of the officials want to answer that in relation to the provisions of this bill. I mean, as a general matter, we do try to update the committee on matters of importance, and I hope that I stick to that. And with regard to the performance of the CAP payment system, we provide regular reports. We haven't actually heard very much back, as I wait for my officials to find the answer to the question. We haven't actually heard very much back from the committee about how well the system is going, but maybe the letters in the post, I don't know, but we're happy to continue, you know, as a matter of general practice, to be serious, to provide the committee with regular reports about all matters that are of importance, and as they develop. I think that's a general duty that we have, and we take very seriously. You know, when something important happens, you know, one of the first questions we ask after we decide how to tackle it is, you know, should we inform the REC committee out of respect to Parliament, and if so, when and how? And we take that very seriously, Convener. So maybe that's, as the officials look in vain for the answer specifically to the bill, maybe that's the answer.
I'm conscious of your answers on that, Cabinet Secretary, and this is a bill that is probably going to last beyond the next election, and my comment is it's just always about making sure that the bill allows correct reporting back. Having Vicky, are you in a position?
So I can confirm that there's no provision in the bill as it's currently drafted, and I think that I'm just trying to find the letter right now, but I think we responded to that either directly in writing to our evidence session to this committee, or indeed in the written response to DPLRC.
I don't think you responded to this committee, it may be to DPLR, but Cabinet Secretary, and at this stage, considering timings and things, actually a written response from you on that would be extremely helpful to me as far as reporting and how that goes.
I mean, we don't, as far as I know, I've just checking, as far as I know, we're not actually under a legal obligation to do much of the reporting that we do. You know, the committee should be aware of what it seeks. If it wants to have statutory provisions to report on everything, then by definition, on the areas where we're not statutorily obliged to report, then a future minister may take the view that all the information I'm providing gratis, out of the goodness of my heart to the committee, in the desire to show respect to Parliament, you know, so it's a two-edged sword. I just say that, but I will write if you wish me to write. I will write.
Cabinet Secretary, in fairness, I know you provide a lot of things out of the goodness of your heart, but it is the responsibility of the committee to look at legislation and to hold the government to account, therefore to answer questions. Perhaps it would be sufficient to say that no doubt you will be responding in detail to the DPLR letter in regards to the points they've raised regarding procedural issues, sunset clauses, periodic reporting to Parliament, and I would ask that we are copied in on that. The next question, therefore, is from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. And I'll indulge that big heart of yours again, or maybe Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you about another letter, please? And this is a letter that, excuse me, the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee has written to Scottish ministers, as I understand yourself and Ms Cunningham, to request clarification on a number of points, in part in relation to the impact of this bill on environment policy. Now, I'm conscious what you've said about future policy, but can you say what it is, what is the Scottish Government's position on the impact this bill should have on the environment, please?
Should have on what, sorry?
On the environment, please.
Well, I don't think this bill will really have, per se, any impact on the environment. I mean, I tried to make clear that, you know, plainly we are rightly bound by existing environmental legislation, and I said that in my opening statement, and I think you've taken that point. So that is the legal framework. I mean, this bill allows us to make changes, but there is no way that these changes will be used to kind of diminish the environmental standards that apply. I think that's the general approach that we take. I thought that I'd made that clear already, but if I'm missing something, please, Mr Finney should ask me to deal with that now.
If I may then, Convener, just a selection of the bullet points we understand that the Eclair Committee put in their letter was, for instance, whether the bill will enable the continuation of environmental incentives, the impact of a 5-year transition period on environmental policy, and whether the Scottish Government have considered a more ambitious approach, whether powers exercised under the bill could have a negative impact on environment policy. So that's three of several.
Well, it's difficult to answer. I mean, I think these are perhaps more policy questions, but we do have the ability to exercise all the powers in the bill. But the reality of the Brexit situation means that the legal backdrop, the UK level and international level in which we will be operating does remain unclear, and I did make that point earlier. I should also say that there is still some uncertainty about what future funding we will receive. So, we do require clarity on the grey areas that I alluded to earlier, which I won't now repeat. But, I just want to finish by assuring Mr Finney that this bill is not in any way intended to downgrade our commitment to high environmental standards. Quite the opposite.
I don't know the protocol for this, Cabinet Secretary, but given I've asked this question, and I think the letter is both to yourself and Ms Cunningham, would it be possible that any reply to that committee be copied to this committee, perhaps?
Of course, yes. I think that's something we can agree to.
Thank you very much indeed. If I may then, also the Clare Committee have also questioned the limitations on exercising the powers in this bill as a result of future arrangements with the UK Government on funding, trade and post-Brexit arrangements and intra-UK common frameworks. Is the ability to exercise powers in this bill uncertain? And what is the Government's position on those constraints?
Well, I don't think that there's uncertainty, should this bill be passed, about the powers it confers upon the Scottish Government. I think there will be clarity about that. I think it is pretty clear. Where there is uncertainty, it is, I'm afraid, uncertainty around the future of funding post-Brexit. Even if, as Mr Chapman says, it turns out that the UK Government do maintain funding at EU levels till 2024, EU policy was on a 7-year basis, and currently they're deliberating on the policy that will apply to 2027. And my understanding is that the UK Treasury in the last session of the UK Government said that all direct payments would cease by 2027. So my point is, even if there is some assurance refunding from the UK to 2024, even if we assume for the purposes of this discussion that that funding will continue for farming, food production, the environment and everything, forestry, to 2024, there's still a question mark lingering about what will happen between 24 and 27, because the last Chancellor of the Exchequer said no more direct payments as from 2027. And indeed, the reduction in direct payments is reducing fairly sharply in accordance with, in England, per Theresa Villiers' plans. And I think the NFU have challenged that. But so I think the uncertainty arises with respect about questions around funding from the UK as opposed to the EU, which, for all the frustrating nature of its stipulations, regulations and rules and penalties, was a fairly good financial friend to rural Scotland, and I would say rural Britain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, there's a couple of members who've very kindly given me the nod that they're happy to have their questions asked by letter, subject to this, considering the time constraints that we're faced. So there will be a follow-up letter on a couple of questions, I believe. So I think it leaves me to thank the witnesses and you, Cabinet Secretary, for coming to the meeting today. And that really concludes the committee's evidence sessions on the bill. And we'll be considering our draft Stage 2 report in the coming weeks. Sorry, Stage 1 report. My mistake. I am going to move straight on. So, Cabinet Secretary, if I could ask you and your... Sorry.
I just wanted to make a small point of clarification regarding a previous answer I gave, with your permission, Convener.
Yes, briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Just that you asked that I write to the committee about the question of reportage about use of the powers and to report periodically to Parliament. And I've since been shown a copy of a letter that has been sent by Vicky Dunlop on the 19th December to the clerk of the DPLR committee, in which that question is answered. So I will provide a copy of that letter to you, because the question has already been answered, that we and the answer is given in the letter. I thought I should just clarify that. We want to be as cooperative as we can.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and we look forward to receiving that letter. So if I could ask you and your team, Cabinet Secretary, to leave quietly while the committee continues with its business, I'd like to move on to agenda item 3, which is European Withdrawal Act 2018, and just say the agenda item 3 is the SIFT of one of the EU exit instruments as detailed on the agenda. The Scottish Government has allocated the negative procedure to this SSI. Does anyone have any comments on that? So is the committee agreed that it is content that the parliamentary procedure allocated to this instrument by the Scottish Government? We are agreed. Therefore, we can move on to agenda item 4, which is subordinate legislation. And this is a consideration of 2 negative instruments as detailed on the agenda. No motions to annul or representations have been received in relation to these instruments. Do any members have any comments on either of these instruments? Stuart.
I think it may be worth considering writing to the government just to ask for some clarity in relation to the plant health, etc. Order that's in front of us. I just note in Schedule 1 to that, to paragraph 1 in Schedule 1, it uses the phrase another part of the Union territory, and that is used elsewhere. Paradoxically, in the transport one that's before us, as a great part of the substance is precisely replacing that phrase so that it isn't referring to another part of the Union, because there isn't really another part of the Union because we're no longer part of the Union. It's just a construct thing. So I'd really like to kind of know about that. The other one is in Schedule 5, where it replaces at 1.3a a reference to a specific Council Directive 2000/29/EC with the more general reference, the EU Plant Health Regulation. In other words, it's no longer specific. Now, I actually welcome that because that is really a keeping pace provision that essentially says whatever the EU health plant regulation is at any particular time, we're tracking it. But I just seek confirmation from the government that that is actually the intention of that particular change, which I would welcome.
Does anyone else have any comments? So my question is really that there are no other recommendations. These are really questions. So is the committee happy that the clerk's right on behalf of the committee to question these points and raise them with the government? Okay, so there is no recommendation, and we are agreed. Okay, so we're now going to go into private session.